Okay. So it's my turn to be very delighted to introduce John Keeley, um, who we were trying to remember if we had any memory of meetings. Says, no, we both just kind of were part of the California, botanical group and knew of each other and interacted occasionally during my time in California, which is why, I figured, well, if we can bring people in from elsewhere, and since fire is definitely a major topic here in Idaho as well as California, and John's certainly one of the people I know who knows most about it, especially if you want to get a different perspective often than whatever is the official statement. So John, let's see, he's a senior research scientist with the USGS, adjunct professor at UCLA, research associate with the California Botanical Garden, which is the new name for Rancho Santa Ana Botanical Garden, former program director at NSF, recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and Ecological Society of America Fellow. He spent 5 sabbaticals in all 5 Mediterranean climate regions of the world. Research includes ecological life history, strategies of plants from fire-prone ecosystems, fire-stimulated seed germination, invasive species, taxonomy of Arctostaphylos, biochemical pathways of photosynthesis, and vernal pool plants, just a few topics. Current research is focused on climate change impacts on future fire regimes, over 400 publications, more than 20,000 citations, and senior author of a book on fire and Mediterranean climate ecosystems. And so I'm delighted to hear what he has to say. We gave him kind of free rein to choose his title, and he chose something nice and non-controversial like Nexus between wildfire, catastrophes, climate, and population growth in California, which I hope is also somewhat appropriate to Idaho. Thank you. Go for it, John. Oh, everybody, if you're not muted yet, be sure to mute.
Thank you, Barbara. Am I coming through? Am I muted or?
You're fine. You're fine.
Okay, great. I'm going to focus mainly on California, but a lot of what I have to say really applies to the Western US, and particularly this year where throughout the West, we've experienced substantial increases in wildfires. Just California alone, we've had over 17 million acres burned just since the year 2000, and this is double the acreage burned in the prior 20 years. And much of that happened this year in 2020. About 4 million of that 17 million acres happened in 2020. Now, I'm going to try and focus on a variety of aspects of this issue of large fire events. This year, climatologists were very vocal about the issue of these fires being the inevitable result of climate change. Fire scientists, however, know it's a lot more complicated than just climate change. And so I'm going to try and give you some of the alternative or additional aspects of this problem. Now, the sort of questions that I'll address are these big wildfires, are they ecological disasters? And then what factors could explain this dramatic rise in fires? Can we parse out the role of global warming? And then lastly, these fires have oftentimes catastrophic impacts on humans and property. And what is the strategy to reduce this impact? I'll try and touch on all these subjects, but all of them could be a talk on their own. Now, I'm going to focus on California, and California is a good place to focus even if you're interested in a broader view of the Western US, because the latitudinal range of the state encompasses a huge part of the latitudinal range of the Western US. From the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state represents latitudes from New Mexico to Wyoming. So it represents a huge latitudinal range. And we have very different fire problems in the part of the state. And we also have very different landscapes, very different ecosystems, and very different population problems. For example, the northern part of the state tends to be dominated by conifer forest, like in many of the mountains in the Western US. Southern part of the state tends to be dominated by shrublands, like a lot of the lower elevation areas in the Western US, although the shrublands in California, which are known as California chaparral, somewhat different in their ecology than, say, Great Basin sage. The other thing that differentiates the state is population density. There's about 10 times more people in the southern part of the state than the northern part of the state. And we also have very different fire patterns in the state. Just in terms of fires per million hectares, we have about an order of magnitude more fires in the southern part of the state than we do in the northern part of the state. And also the causes are different. Northern part of the state, mostly forested landscapes, the majority of fires are started by lightning. Only 45% on average are due to humans. Southern part of the state, it's probably 99% of the fires are started by humans. The other thing that is very different is the impact of past fire management. Very different. This figure here, which is from a Forest Service document, shows the colors here represent different impacts of past fire management on what we think were the indigenous fire frequencies in the landscapes. The blue areas here indicate landscapes that are believed to have had fewer fires in the last 100 years than would have been the case in pre-Euro-American time. In other words, there's been a deficit of fire in the last 100 years in these forests in the northern part of the state. Southern part of the state, almost the opposite. In other words, we've had an excess of fires, far more fires in the last 100 years than we ever saw prior to European settlement. And almost certainly a lot of this is tied to the population of that landscape, because almost all these fires are started by people. Just a brief description of the fires in these landscapes. Forests in the northern part of the state tend to historically have burned in what we call surface fire regimes, where fires would burn in the understory, and often trees would survive and they would burn just in the surface fuels. The lower elevation, shrublands, chaparral, not unlike sage scrub in the Great Basin, burned in crown fire regimes where the entire canopy would be consumed. Totally different fire regimes, had very different impacts, both in terms of the ecology of these systems as well as the management. Now, in forest, we tend to get low intensity surface fires, and they tend to leave the trees intact, but they often are totally destructive to the reproduction underneath them. As a result, reproduction in these forests tends to be dominated in openings within the forest canopy, so that when fires come through, there are some trees that survive in those openings, whereas most of them are killed in the understory. Now, we have a rich history throughout the Western US. Literally thousands of studies have used fire scars on trees. And this happens when you have a low intensity surface fire, burns through the forest, scars a tree, and the tree survives, but it leaves a scar. And then the next fire comes through and it'll do it again after the tree's recovered. And you get this rich history of past fires. And this is a cross section through a tree, conifer. The pith would be down here. Each of these arrows indicates a previous fire. And as you can see, up until about 1900 in this particular forest, fires were relatively frequent. Every 10 to 20 years, you would get a low intensity surface fires. But then for the last 100 years, no more fire. And this is largely the result of fire suppression, which has eliminated fires in many of our Western forests. The downside of fire suppression is if you lack these low intensity surface fires, you get accumulation of fuels, and that contributes to, as well as an ingrowth of young trees, and that contributes to very different fuel conditions. So when you get a fire, the fires behave very differently. This landscape here, all of the landscape you see in this image burned in the same fire. The foreground illustrates what we would think of as the natural fire regime of low intensity surface fires burning in the understory, perhaps taking out patches of trees here and there, which would contribute to regeneration sites. But in the background, we see an anomalous pattern, which is generally thought not to have been typical of historical conditions. And this represents a crown fire that took out the entire forest. The downside of doing this is regeneration by these trees is dependent on seeds from surviving trees dispersing into sites that were burned. So for example, this site here will regenerate from seeds coming from adjacent trees around it. Whereas this landscape here is a long way from surviving trees, and it will be a long time without assisted regeneration for these forests to ever recover. And so this is a very different landscape than what we believe historically was the case. Now, the big question we have is how long would it take for this landscape to recover to its original conifer forest? But there's also the possibility this landscape may regenerate or may be on a trajectory to produce shrublands as opposed to forest, or even regenerate into grasslands. So there's a lot of unknowns about what will happen to these landscapes, which were not generally what we thought of the native landscapes in Western conifer forests. So what we'd have to say in terms of the ecosystem impact of these fires is Western forests are adapted to frequent understory fires, and human perturbations in the fire regime by putting out fires have caused fuels to accumulate, and they can lead to ecological disasters, such as what we're describing here in this background photo. Now, shrublands, on the other hand, are adapted to rather infrequent high intensity fires that take out the entire canopy. And we don't have any evidence that there's been a hiatus in burning like we see in the Western forest. In other words, this is the fire scar data from Western forest here, where you see this is going from like the 1700s up to the present. And throughout the West, we see basically a cessation of fires and essentially no fires in the last 100 years, which created this problem of fuels in shrublands of Southern California, going from San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles. This is data from written records that we have of area burn. And what we see is in the last 100 years, there's really been no reduction in fire. In other words, they have not had a suppression of past fires. Even though the policy has been to try and put out fires, they haven't been successful. So we've not ever seen this cessation of fires like we see in forests. And what these landscapes look like after a fire usually is completely denuded of all vegetation. But if you go back to these burned chaparral sites after, say, just 3 or 4 months with a good rainfall winter, they recover very rapidly. And this is what a chaparral site would look like 3 months after a wildfire. So it has no problem recovering, and it does it in a number of ways. Many of the shrub species, in fact, all the genera of woody plants in chaparral have some species that resprout from the base. This is our most ubiquitous shrubs, chamise. This is the genus Arctostaphylos. Many of them resprout. A variety of others resprout from the base. So they recover rapidly from resprouting. We also have a lot of species that recover from seeding after a fire. In other words, 2 of our largest genera, for example, the genus Ceanothus, this blue-flowered shrub here, as well as the genus Arctostaphylos, are very large. They're the largest woody genera in the state, something like 60 to 70 species in the each of those genera. And the majority of species have the capacity to regenerate by seeds after a fire. And they do that because they produce seeds that are dormant, they go into the soil, and they lay dormant until a fire stimulates their germination. And when they germinate all at once right after a fire. This is a study of a number of Ceanothus species. And this is the percentage of seedlings that occurred in the first year, second year, third, fourth, fifth year after fire. What you can see is they all come up in the first year. And then after that, there's essentially no more seedling recruitment. So these species are adapted to produce dormant seeds. They sit in the soil, they can stay there for 100 years until a fire comes, and then you get a massive recruitment right after the fire. And so these are what we call post-fire seeders. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know I had that. The other thing that is of interest in these shrubland systems is we have a great many wildflowers. In fact, we have well over 100 species of wildflowers that are largely restricted to post-fire conditions. And so this is an area that burned the previous year, and this is the following spring. And these are a diversity of different species that come up after fire. And many of them haven't been seen for decades since the previous fire. And there's a lot of interest in what triggers that germination. We did a lot of studies over a period of time with students where we tried to figure out exactly what was stimulating the germination of these species. And this is just an illustration of 6 different post-fire species, some of them annuals like this Antirrhinum and Amananthe species, some of them perennials like this Romney and Salvia species. But what we have found is the majority of these species, if you put them under control conditions, in other words, you just take the seeds, give them water and light, majority of them won't germinate. We've also tried giving them intense heat shock, for example, 105, 115 degrees centigrade. Most of these species in particular don't germinate at all with heat. But if you provide them with charred wood or smoke from burning wood, we find that the majority of these species are stimulated to germinate by apparently chemicals from the charred wood and smoke. And so it's clear they have evolved a very precise relationship to fire that almost undoubtedly evolved over long periods of time. So in other words, this chaparral system is not just fire adapted, but it's fire dependent, and it indicates a long coevolution with fire. And in fact, the fossil record supports that. If you look at the fossil record going all the way back in the Western US to the Eocene, 54 million years ago, all of the common genera, or most all of the common genera in chaparral date back to about the Eocene. So they've been around a very long period of time. Although this characteristic of the Arctostaphylos and Ceanothus of producing fire-dependent seeds seems to be more recent. They seem to be more related to about mid-Miocene in terms of their origin in the system. Now, we can conclude that these shrublands are fire adapted, but the important thing is they're adapted to infrequent crown fires. In other words, if you have fires at 2 to 3 decade scale, they do just fine. And the reason they do fine is because that period of time allows them to produce seeds that go back into the soil so that they have a seed bank ready to recruit after a fire. What we've seen in many parts, particularly in California, but we're seeing this throughout the Great Basin, human predations in the fire frequency have led to ecological disasters. And the primary disaster is the loss of native biodiversity and replacement with exotic, usually grasses. And this is an illustration of an example of that in Southern California. This whole landscape you see in this photo burned in 1970. It was all chaparral at the time. Then it recovered, but in the middle part of this scene here burned again in 2001. So 31 years after the 1970 fire. And what you're seeing in the mid part of this is all native shrub regeneration and species. But in the foreground, we have a landscape that has burned 3 times during that period of time, most frequently the cedar fire from 2003 on a landscape that was only 2 years old at the time. And all of this is exotic grasses, mostly Bromus rubens or madrotensis, that has taken over the landscape. And this is our primary problem with fire-prone ecosystems, is sometimes They are adapted to fires, but it's not fire per se they're adapted to. They're adapted to a particular fire frequency. And if you increase that frequency, you can have catastrophic impacts. And here's another illustration from the Santa Monica Mountains near Los Angeles. This is a landscape dominated by chaparral. Here's the same landscape where it burned 3 times in 12 years, and we've lost the native shrubland, replaced it with these exotic grasses. And this has a lot of ecological impacts. Not only have we lost native biodiversity, but we've also have impacts on the hydrology of the system because these annual grasses are not able to hold the slope as well during rainfall events. And so we likely will result in excessive erosion from this landscape. So there are a lot of impacts by having too much fire in a fire adapted ecosystem. Now let's go to the question of what factors can explain this 21st century rise in fires. In other words, can we parse out the role of global warming? Because it's being given a lot of play today, particularly in the press, that global warming is explaining why we're having this increase in fires in recent years. I think that the only way to really understand this question is to recognize that across California in particular, but it also applies throughout the Western US, that we really have very different types of fire regimes. And in California, it's clearly revealed in the fires we see in the Sierra Nevada mountains and the Northern California forest. These are really fuel dominated fires. And they're due to excessive fire suppression, which is reduced fires, cause fuels to accumulate. And most of our big fires are related in one way or another to fire suppression. We have other systems though in the southern part of the state, all the way from about Santa Barbara to Southern California, but we also have the same phenomenon in the North Bay area around San Francisco, and that is wind-dominated fires, which are due to extreme wind events that are anomalous events that don't typically occur everywhere. They're not due to fire exclusion or anomalous accumulation of fuels, but these extreme wind events. And we can actually pick out fires that we would describe as fuel dominated versus wind dominated fires in the state. These blue areas here largely represent landscapes where historically we've had really important fuel dominated fires in the past. The southern part of the state, we can pick out a lot of fires which are really wind dominated fires. And the characteristics that distinguish these, number one is the timing. Fuel dominated fires tend to be summer fires. Wind dominated fires tend to be autumn and winter fires, and that's largely due to the timing of the Santa Ana winds that drive these anomalous fire events. In terms of causes, they're often very different. The fuel dominated fires in the mountains tend to be lightning ignited by and large. The fires that are wind dominated in the southern part of the state, almost all of them are human caused fires. And in particular, in recent years, many of these are due to downed power lines. The other thing that differentiates these two types of fires is the impact on humans. The fuel dominated fires, generally people don't die. We don't usually have a lot of structures lost, unlike the wind dominated fires where we often have major loss of lives and huge losses of property. So there's really these two very different types of fires. And this is really a subjective distinction here. For any given fire, you couldn't necessarily say it was due entirely to one or the other, but these are the extremes that are used just to illustrate how different factors might affect fires. This just illustrates one of the characteristics of fuel dominated fires. This is the Paiute fire in the Sierra Nevada, 2008. And this black line here is the perimeter. The slashed area indicates all the area that burned. The colors indicate areas that had burned previously. what you can see is the vast majority of this landscape has never had a recorded fire, going all the way back to 1910. So it illustrates this is a landscape with a lot of anomalously old fuels, which would have burned if it hadn't been for fire suppression. Another example, the Rush Fire would have been the biggest fire in California, except that a lot of it burned in Nevada. And of course, people who tally these things won't count that because it's in a different state. At any rate, it was a huge fire. Most of this landscape had not had a previous fire. It was very old. Now, these fuel-dominated fires sometimes have important winds associated with them. Just one illustration is in Northern California, we had this extreme fire called the Carr Fire, and it had a lot of areas that had gone without previous burning, had huge fuel accumulation. That huge fuel accumulation produced this massive heat and what is called a pyrocumulus cloud that developed, and it even led to a tornado-like fire. And we've seen the same sort of thing in anomalously old fuels in shrublands as well, where you get this plume developing from excessively old fuels and producing high heat. And then that cloud often will collapse, and when it does, you get wind blown in all the directions. Now, we don't think of these as wind-dominated fires because they're distinctly different from what we're calling wind-dominated fires, because these winds could actually be controlled if we could manage the fuels so that we didn't accumulate large levels of fuels. That's very different than the wind-dominated fires, which are due to conditions we can't control. For example, our extreme wind-driven fires, known as foehn winds, often result in the autumn due to a high pressure system off in the Great Basin, low pressure system off the coast, and you get these extreme winds blowing offshore from the interior. And this is an illustration in Southern California of one of our big fire events. These are smoke plumes from 2003 from San Diego up to Santa Barbara. And these are being blown often at 50, 60 miles per hour in the autumn under very low humidity, often less than 10% relative humidity. So extreme smoke or fire conditions. In 2017, we saw a similar event due to north winds in Northern California in the autumn also. And these smoke plumes are offshore flows that are being blown at very high velocities under very low humidity conditions. These are wind events that we really can't control. An illustration of some of the characteristics of these wind events. These are Santa Ana wind days throughout the year. And what you see is they tend to dominate in the autumn. And what's particularly severe about autumn Santa Ana winds is if you overlay the climate diagram for Southern California, these dots here indicate drought. So the winds occur at the end of our normal drought period. So they create particularly hazardous fire conditions. What is completely different from these wind-dominated fires in Southern California from the fuel-dominated fires in the Sierra Nevada is when you look at the fire perimeter, this is the Woolsey fire from 2018, almost none of this landscape has escaped previous burns. And in fact, and here's the Thomas fire, the same from 2017, one of our largest fires, same thing. They've all been burned repeatedly. In other words, in Southern California, with over 40 million people, fires are very frequent, and these landscapes are just being burned constantly. As a result, they're not due to anomalously high fuel loads. They're due to the extreme wind events. Now, can we parse out the role of global warming? We've done a number of studies, and this will just summarize some of the general patterns we see. We've looked at Sierra Nevada forest in the north versus Southern California shrublands, and we've evaluated over a period of 109 years for US Forest Service lands in the Sierra Nevada, what the winter temperatures, spring temperatures, summer temperatures, and autumn temperatures were relative to the amount of area burned that year. what we see is spring and summer temperature, highly significant effect. In other words, as spring and summer temperatures go up, we get more area burned. So there's a very strong climate signal in the Sierra Nevada forest. And this is true, it's been shown in a number of studies throughout the Western US that in forests, we tend to see spring and summer temperatures are highly deterministic in terms of how much area burns that year. But if we look at Southern California, we see no relationship between the temperatures in any season and the amount of area burned. And we believe the primary reason for this is in Southern California, it's always hot enough and dry enough for a fire, so that those years that are hotter and drier don't necessarily make a difference. For example, this is the Sierra Nevada summer temperatures that are related to the highest area burn, 19 degrees centigrade. That's the lowest temperature we see in Southern California. So it's always hot enough in Southern California to carry a fire. So it's not the annual variation in temperatures that have a big effect. And in general, what we've seen in the last 50 years is we can explain about over 50% of the variation from one year to the next, just knowing temperature in the spring versus temperature in the summer. If we look in Southern California, though, we don't see any relationship between the climate and area burn, with the exception of the last 50 years, we've started to see a relationship between prior year precipitation and area burn. And we believe that's due to a massive amount of type conversion that's happened from shrublands to grasslands, not at all unlike what we are seeing in the Great Basin, where Great Basin sage is being replaced by cheatgrass. We've seen a massive increase in type conversion in the last 50 years in the southern part of the state. And prior year precipitation, basically when it goes up, it produces more and more grass. As a result, the following year, we see more fire activity. So the role of climate is really in Southern California to affect grass growth. Now let's just look at 2020. If you look up the Urban Dictionary definition of 2020, they define it as hell. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. In California, we had more than 4 million acres burned. That's more than double. And there was more than double that in the Western US this last year. Now, this was due to more than just climate change, although the climatologists will tell you this is what you need to focus on. There are a lot of reasons why 2020 was so bad, at least in California. We had what I would describe the perfect storm. We had a low rainfall year in the north. 50% of normal rain led to summer vegetation having less moisture. Then we had this massive dry lightning storm in August, over 5,000 fires. Now, climatologists will say, well, this is an indication of anthropogenic climate change, but it really isn't an anomalous event. About every 10 years, we get massive lightning storms in the state. The last one was in 2008 in Northern California and burned over 1 million acres. So we do get these lightning storms, but not on an annual basis, about every decade. Prior to 2008, we had one in 1999. Prior to that, about 10 years before, we had another one. So we get these massive dry lightning storms about once a decade. But this year, it was coupled not just with lower than normal winter rainfall. We had this very long and intense heat wave in September. And certainly there's reason to believe that that's related to anthropogenic climate change, but we don't really have good definitive evidence of that at the present time. But there's no question this intense heat wave was phenomenal. We saw a longer heat wave that persisted across the Western US, produced temperatures not previously known, and it greatly increased flammability of the vegetation and is reflected in a lot of high temperature records that were broken. But climate isn't the only story here. Fire suppression in the forest, we estimate that in Sierra Nevada forest, we have about 5 times greater fuel loads due to fire suppression over the last century. that almost certainly is a factor in how bad these fires were. But then we had this massive drought from 2012, 2017, caused extensive dieback of vegetation. And this is just an illustration from the Palmer Drought Severity Index from about 2012 to 2017. We had very severe drought throughout the region, and we saw lots of dieback. This is a view outside my back door in the Sierra Nevada. This is Case Mountain, 2016, and these are all dead ponderosa pine. And in fact, across the Sierra Nevada, this is just a map of the severity of dieback. We had massive dieback of estimated about 140 million trees died during this drought period. We also have seen the same thing in Southern California, and we've recently finished a study where we estimated the dieback within the Woolsey fire perimeter, and all of this red indicates extensive dieback due to the drought, which almost certainly contributed to the magnitude of that fire. Now, just a few words about these wind-driven fires. As I said, they're driven by this offshore flow, occurs in the autumn, and produces extremely severe fires. There's a lot of attention now that has been tied to how climate might be affecting these. But the important thing to recognize about these Santa Ana wind-driven fires is the vast majority of them never have any fire at all. Almost 70% of all our Santa Ana wind days don't have fires. And so what that tells us is the wind per se is not what determines whether or not a fire. It's whether or not somebody starts a fire, and humans are the number one. In fact, they're the only source of fires during Santa Ana winds in Southern California. And increasingly, this is from the red here indicates in the last 35 years, 1984 to 2018, the dominant sources have been arson and power line failures. And the effect of these human ignitions, both intentional and accidental, is that we're getting more and more area burned. And it's important to realize that this is almost certainly tied to population density. Since 2000, we've seen a doubling in area burned. Climatologists point out that this is tied to an increase in temperature, but if somebody looked at the demography, they would see it's also related to an additional 6 million people to the state, and 100% of our Santa Ana wind-driven fires are due to people. So there is a lot of reason to think that maybe we ought to be focusing a little bit more on population growth, because the increase in population not only increases probability of an ignition during severe wind events, but it increases the number of people at risk and is almost certainly part of the reason we're seeing more people killed and more homes destroyed during these severe wind events. This is just an illustration of how changes in population are related to changes in the impact of these fires. 2017, the city of Santa Rosa was impacted by this massive fire, which is illustrated by this red, or excuse me, the black outline here, fire perimeter of the Tubbs fire. Burned 36,000 acres, 22 people died, 5,643 structures were lost. What's interesting is the red perimeter here shows a 1964 fire, which burned almost exactly the same area. The Hanley fire was much larger, but there were no fatalities and only about 100 structures lost. What's different is in 1964, the city of Santa Rosa only had 30,000 people. Today, it has 270,000 people. So almost certainly this change in demography has to have some role in accounting for why we're having greater losses in terms of people and structures. And this illustrates the changes we've seen in these fire perimeters. This is a Hanley fire of 1964. The tan here indicates low density housing, just a little bit into the perimeter of the Hanley fire. 2017, here's the Tubbs fire, and this is all low density urban housing as well as high density housing. So one of the major factors that accounts for these losses in 2017 is not just climate change, it's demography and population growth. And on top of that, we're seeing power lines are a major source of these fires, and power lines are almost certainly tied to population growth. More people means an increase in the electrical grid. And you can see that in power line ignited fires. Between 1981 and 1999, 112,000 acres were burned by power line ignited fires. In the last 18 years, we've had 500,000 acres burned by power line fires. So there's no question that population growth has to be part of the problem that we're seeing in this landscape. Now, the last thing I would just end with is, how do we deal with protecting wind-dominated landscapes or wind-dominated fire landscapes? We know a lot about how to deal with fuel-dominated landscapes, and that really has to do with fuel treatments. And there's a lot that's written and discussed about fuel-dominated forests and how we need to treat fuels. So I won't go into that, but I'll just talk about what can we do about wind-dominated fires, because it's a very different problem. First off, we need to recognize what I call the 5 Ps, and that is it's due to people, prevention, planning, protection, and prediction. Number one, wind-dominated fires occur on a landscape that is really more a people problem than a fuel problem. 100% of these fires are ignited by people, and we've got an additional 6 million people in California since 2000, and it's growing every year. In fact, for the last 5 decades, California has grown at the rate of 300,000 people a year. Unfortunately, only 30,000 a year leave. So in my view, population growth is perhaps a greater threat than global warming for these types of fires. Prevention, rather than focusing on fuel treatments, because we've seen these landscapes get burned repeatedly, they don't have an anomalous accumulation of fuels. Rather than wasting money on fuel treatments, we need to be focusing on how to prevent fires on these landscapes. Other things that we could focus on: planning. Community planning needs to give recognition to fires. For example, there's a long history by urban planners to focus on controlling where people live relative to earthquakes and floods. They often zone areas against building if they're subjected to earthquakes and floods. We need to have a similar treatment with respect to fire. In other words, there needs to be focus on fire zoning. Protection is a whole nother issue. There is a need for fuel treatments immediately around homes, but there are other things that we can do to reduce the impact of fires on home. For example, embers are largely what destroy homes, and there are a lot of things we can do to reduce ember landing and igniting fires on homes. And then the last thing is we need a lot more interest or focus on prediction of where fires are going to go once they get ignited in these extreme wind events. So I'll just end it there, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciated your breadth of knowledge on these topics and bringing together a comprehensive view for us on all these factors that are happening out on the landscape. I'm just so appreciative of you joining us this evening.